This last video overview will be just a little different in that I'm going to deal with the interlude between chapters 9 and 10 and chapter 10, which deals with jazz. Now, some professors will separate these two out. So if you do that in your class, do that. I'm going to talk about both things in this one video. We start with the interlude, which is kind of bridging the gap. It doesn't belong in any specific chapter, but it talks a little bit about things that are addressed throughout the book, particularly arts issues and how music is funded and music education. And so we talk about that a lot. I link you to the book I mentioned earlier, Who's Afraid of Classical Music by Mike Walsh. And I give you a section of his book called Modern Composers, where I think he does a brilliant job of talking about what's going on in classical music today. And the one thing that I think is missing in this section, and I talk about it coming up, is education. And of course, as a college professor, someone who's written these kind of books, I feel strongly about music education. Most of you who are online are going to do some pretty extensive writing about your thoughts about the future of classical music, how it's going to exist, what can we change, what can we do differently, how do we go about education. And this is a good place to start. Chapter 10 deals in a very short amount of time with the history of jazz. And the reason I've put it here is because there are people, in particular a guy named Dr. Billy Taylor, who is a brilliant jazz pianist and scholar, who say, look, what the Western European community gave us was classical music. And what America gave the world is jazz. And jazz is really becoming America's classical music. And so this chapter is a very quick, lightning fast overview of the precursors of jazz through traditional jazz, in particular Louis Armstrong, the swing era, Duke Ellington, Count Basie, Benny Goodman, then more modern jazz, Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie doing bebop, Thelonious Monk, the cool school, in particular Miles Davis and the album Kind of Blue, which is a critical turning point in jazz in the late 1950s. More aggressive hard bop, John Coltrane, Charles Mingus, people like that. Free jazz, the same stuff you saw in Chapter 9 from John Cage, we started doing it in classical music with people like Ornette Coleman, Cecil Taylor, and again, John Coltrane embraced this as well. And then crazier dudes, people like Sun Ra and others. And then we began to bring rock and roll and other pop music elements in. Fusion music. Guess what? It's Miles Davis again. But then it's the Mahavishnu Orchestra and a band called Weather Report. And then there's more commercial fusion, the more pop side of fusion. And then we deal with recent trends, things that are happening in the last 20 or 30 years. I like this little piece of art. It's from the Village Voice from about 30 years ago now, but I was there when it happened, which is kind of cool. Jazz at Lincoln Center is doing some amazing educational outreach these days. This is a great website for that. There were a group of guys in the 80s and 90s called the Young Lions, Wynton, Branford Marsalis, and others. You have a beautiful link to Double Rondo on the River, a really cool piece of his. There are listening guides throughout this chapter. Kenny G, we go through hip-hop influences, things like Us Three, Country Music Connection, what's happening now, and I've given you some links for that. Now, there is one huge difference here that I sort of skipped over, and let me go back. There are listening guides embedded throughout this chapter, but unlike the others, we do not have the legal rights for this music. Now, we've paid for the legal rights for all of the classical music you've just studied in chapters 2 through 9. We don't have them here, so you need to have legal access, but if you have it, you can click on these links, and it'll take you to Spotify and play the music for you, which is really cool. If you don't have Spotify, get it, because it's absolutely fantastic. But you can also find, if you don't have it, you can plug in MainStem on YouTube or Napster or whatever listening you use, and you can find other ways to stream this music. A lot of your professors will have a playlist for Spotify or for Napster, and certainly this is the bare minimum. MainStem is one of literally thousands of tracks that Duke Ellington recorded in his long career. So you can absolutely branch out from here and discover as much as you want. There's actually another class we teach at New Mexico State that is strictly Music 201. It's jazz history. A lot of other universities do various permutations of jazz to rock or things like that. So it depends on where you are. You could study jazz far more extensively if you wanted to. And if you don't, just go do it anyway, because America needs as many jazz fans, the world needs as many jazz fans as it could get. And this is a good place to start. So there you go. Two very different things, a consideration of the arts and their place in culture today. And it really does bridge the gap between jazz and classical, because jazz is kind of viewed the same way now. It's kind of thought as an esoteric music. Oh, that's not for me. And it's not. It's for everybody. This music is for everybody. And so I encourage you to go out and experience it. This is a good way to start. So, an interlude in chapter 10, jazz.